Good afternoon, students. I'm Shankar. I'm going to deal with the course English for PUC 1 students this semester. In English, we are going to concepts. One is prose and the other one is poetry. And first lesson is all about happiness. It's a poem. Before going into the text, let us look at the concept of poetry. What is poetry? Why poems are written? Why poets express their feelings in different languages, or why poets express their feelings and emotions without following any grammar in the poetry. So poetry, according to some people, poetry is nothing but expression of life. But some of the scholars and Greek poets and philosophers, they expressed that poetry is nothing but outbursting of feelings. When it comes to Plato, a very famous Greek philosopher, he rejected poetry. He said poetry is thrice removed from reality. Therefore, poetry is not reality. So all the poets must be banned from Greek. That is what he said. But when it comes to Aristotle, Aristotle was the disciple of Plato. He said poetry has to be welcomed because poetry is nothing but imitation. He wrote a theory, the name of the theory is called mimesis, in which he explained in detail that poetry is poetry is natural. Poetry is nothing but imitation. He said a child learns its language through its mother. So child learns everything through its mother by imitation. So imitation is natural, whereas poetry also is natural. That is what Aristotle emphasized. And later on, several scholars and philosophers rejected poetry, and several scholars and philosophers encouraged poetry. So there were many discussions in the history of philosophy and literature. But however, some of the great poems are there in English literature as well as in other languages. But let us look at the American poetry now. Whereas Indian poets we have and British poets we have, and the poetry is in different forms like pentameter or stanza, hectometer. So there are different meters also followed in poetry, and if there is no rhyming scheme in the poetry, that is what is called blank verse. Shakespeare, one of the famous writers of English literature, he produced 37 dramas in the form of poetry, that is in the form of blank verse. It means Shakespeare did not follow the rhyming scheme in his poetry. So poetry has long history, and nobody knows what was the first poem written on this world or written in this world. Nobody knows. So the history of poetry is not known. So who exactly wrote the first poem in the world? Nobody knows. So there is no proper historical data of poetry. But however, we can trace the data of poetry from Greek literature, from ancient Sanskrit literature, as well as Anglo-Saxon periods literature, later on Middle English period and modern period, now post-modern period. So this is all about poetry, a brief introduction of poetry. Now let us look at the poem of our lesson, that is what is happiness. Happiness is the name of a poem. And when it comes to poets have the license to use any kinds of words without grammar in their poetry. For example, the name of the poem is called Road Not Taken. The Road Not Taken is a poem written by Robert Frost, American writer. The title itself is very confusing. The road not taken means whether the road should not be taken, or whether road has not been taken, or whether the road will not be taken. So the road not taken, what does it mean? This means the poets have license to use words without any grammar. So if you look at poetry, in poetry you can't find grammar. You can find only lines, verses. that conveys meaning, but you can't find grammar in the poetry. So if you look at the poem Happiness, Happiness is a poem written by American writer. So here the writer wants to know what exactly the happiness is, what happiness is all about. How do you define happiness? And when you feel happy, what does it mean? If you say that I am happy, what does it mean? If you say that I am unhappy, what does it mean? What is the difference between happiness and unhappiness? Whether the happiness is an abstract word or a concrete one. Again the philosophy occurs, concrete philosophy and abstract philosophy. Abstract philosophy is nothing but about the feelings and emotions that cannot be seen but that can be felt. But when it comes to concrete philosophy talks about the things that are visible, that are seen, that are experienced, that can be shared. But whether happiness is a concrete or abstract, again this also has confusion. And if your happiness might become unhappiness to some others, and some others' happiness becomes your unhappiness. So there are vice versa paradoxes, metonymy, many things are there. So how exactly you define the word happiness? Here the writer is trying to define in his own way. Here the narrator is nothing but the poet. The poet wants to know what exactly the happiness is all about. So before reading the text, what are the objectives of this poem? The major objective of this poem is to understand what happiness is all about. And happiness, it could be much talked about and it could be less understood emotion. Look at this terminology. It is much talked about. Yes, everybody wants to be happy. I want to be happy. You want to be happy. Everybody tries to be happy. So nobody is really happy. So everybody tries to be happy, but nobody is really happy. So this you can understand. Much talked about it and less understood emotion. And to prove the learners that living and experience matter a lot. So we need to live. And Oscar Wilde, a very famous writer, who says that very few people live, but most people exist. Exist in the sense they exist. They don't live. So living is different thing. So how you live, how you feel. So living and experiencing and sharing, these three are very important in human life. And here the poet has given much importance to living and experiencing. And he also says that the value of happiness in human life, that human life is meant to be happy actually, but unfortunately the people create their own hells. Even in Buddhism also talks about Buddha, he sits somewhere in the light. He sees the people in the darkness, stumbling in the darkness, drowning in their own hells, creating their lives as hells. So again Buddhism also talks about happiness. Even if you look at Jainism, talks about happiness. And in the history of philosophy, Charvaka philosophy, which gave much importance to happiness. And Charvaka philosophy was very much vexed up with all this spirituality, and that philosophy only emphasized on materialistic pleasures. They said eat, drink and enjoy because you are going to die tomorrow. So this is how Charvakas, they derived the meaning of happiness in their perspectives. So here if it comes to the poet Carl August Sandburg, who was born in 1878, died in 1967, was a very famous American poet. And he was the winner of Pulitzer Prize. Pulitzer Prize was the highest award. He is the highest award given by the American government. Even whereas Robert Frost, another famous poet, he also was awarded with the Pulitzer Prize. Even Jhumpa Lahiri is a very famous Indian writer who was born in India and grown up in America, Indo-American writer. She also won the prize, Pulitzer Prize. Pulitzer Prize is the highest literary award given by the American government. So Sandburg was very famous for his extraordinary literary work, that is biography of Abraham Lincoln. He was an excellent student, extraordinary and excellent student, but he had to leave school to support his family and to support his family members. So in order to support his family, he had to work as a paper boy, and he delivered milk, and he assisted in barber shops, and he washed dishes and painted house, and he took up So he did all these works to assist his family, but later on he took up journalism and he produced wonderful poems in some of the journals. So even if you look at American literature, in many of American poets, they were not actually rich and they were not extraordinary writers, but they became extraordinary writers after working in all these fields. About this poem is nothing but a questioning and answering of what exactly happiness is all about, and it establishes that experience matters a lot, experience matters a lot, and experience is more important than education, and it emphasizes living and experience are more important in human life. And he also emphasizes that man is very comfortable in the lap of human nature. Even John Locke, a very famous philosopher, who says that go back to the nature because nature is the ultimate teacher. That's what John Locke and Herbert Spencer, all these writers emphasized in their writings. Now the gist of the poem is the narrator wants to know what happiness is all about. He asks all the people, professors, he asks teachers, he asks executives, he asks the people what happiness is. But all these people, they express their inability to answer. They express their inability to answer this question, what happiness is all about. But at last, this writer, this narrator, he goes across a river, a river in America. He finds a few young Hungarians who sit under a tree and they drink beer with their wives, with their family members, and they share their happiness. That moment, the author realizes that is what exactly happiness is all about. That living in the present moment and enjoying the present moment is all happiness. Here, the writer says that money and success do not matter. Money and success may not give you much, may not give you happiness, but the present moment, the living and experiencing, all these give you happiness. This is what exactly the poet wants to tell us in his poem. Right? He also says that life and wisdom and experience and everything is outside, not inside the libraries. Library in books might give you knowledge, but experience you cannot get it from library. Experience from human living you can get. So the poem says, the poetry is like this: I ask the professors who teach the meaning of life to tell me what happiness is. The professors refuse. No, the professors do not know what happiness is all about. Yeah, the writer goes to the professors and asks, I ask the professors who teach the meaning of life to tell me what happiness is. And I went to famous executives, famous business magnates who boss the work of thousands of people, and they do not know what happiness is. They all shook their heads and gave me a smile as though I was trying to fool with them. I went to the professor, I went to the executives, I asked them what happiness is. They refused. They do not know. They express their inability, and they smile and they think that I am fooling them. And one fine Sunday afternoon, I wandered out along with the Des Plaines River in America. I find a few Hungarians, and I saw a crowd of Hungarians under the trees with their women and children, and having a keg of beer and an accordion in the sense a musical instrument. So they are having a beer under the tree with their children and with their family and with music, and the poet realizes that is exactly what happiness is. But the professors and the executives, the other scholars do not know, or they express their inability to answer his question. So this is a brief introduction of the poetry. We'll discuss other things in the next video. Thank you.